Hello, welcome to our podcast. It comes to us courtesy of the Touro Law Review and the Touro College Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center. Our guest today is Professor Scott Burris, who is Director of the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple Law School. Professor Burris, welcome.
Hi.
We always like to begin by asking our guests how they came to be where they are at this point in their career. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit of background with respect to your own career.
Well, it's been a long one. I'm getting on. In fact, if I measure it by pandemics, I'd say that this is COVID has been my third. I started working in public health law during the AIDS epidemic in the very early days. And while I was in law school as a law student, when there was nothing on AIDS in the law, in the legal literature, I organized a book with a bunch of my fellow students and professors called AIDS in the Law, a Guide for the Public, that was published in 1987, which was a comprehensive look at the legal issues of HIV/AIDS. I then went to work after a clerkship with the ACLU, working on AIDS issues. And in 1991, I became a law professor at Temple University, where I still am a law professor. And gradually, through my work in AIDS, got interested in the issue of overdose because I was working with HIV among drug users. And also, I got quite interested in, I guess, what you could call the problem of what the law does, as opposed to the question of what the law says. And more worked my way into empirical research on the effects of laws. In 2009, I was fortunate enough to get $20 million+ from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to start a program to support research on the health effects of laws and legal practices. And since then, that's grown into a pretty large center at Temple University that provides technical assistance and training and open source legal data for legal evaluation. And that's where I am today, still working on overdose after all these years.
Before you entered law school, you had a background in empirical research or statistics or a related field?
No, just the opposite. I'm an enumerate person who was in show business before law school. I was a theatrical producer and playwright and lyricist for several years. Seems like a long time ago. And that's probably what got me more interested and aware of HIV, because I was working in a community where HIV was already ravaging by the time I hit law school in 1984.
Yeah, we're roughly of the same era. I went to law school in 1980, did work with a lot of theater professionals very early in my career. And before anybody knew what AIDS was, what HIV was, our friends were suffering from it. The last comment I'll make is for better or worse, you're measuring your tenure in pandemics, but it does sound like you were passionate about these health law issues really from the beginning, which is not always the case.
Well, at a certain point, you become, I kind of reached the conclusion that, well, pretty much everything that mattered in the world was somehow tied either to public health or to law or both. For example, if you think about civil rights and civil liberties and stigma and treating people with dignity, that was at the core of the fight against HIV in the same way that it's at the core of the fight against overdose. People were being attacked for having the disease. They were being stigmatized and blamed for a virus. And the way to effectively reduce transmission of HIV was paved by human rights, by the appreciation and support of the people at risk, rather than the condemnation and criminalization and stigmatization. And of course, that's really the same thing with opioids. As long as we treat drug use as a blameworthy criminal enterprise, we are going to have a really hard time stopping the deaths that drug use can cause.
Well, let's focus specifically on opioids and addiction and other aspects of the of the crisis. That's really our topic for today. And it's not, you've already started to do it for us, but I would ask you to begin by just offering your insights as to what factors you believe do contribute to the addiction and the crisis that we're currently struggling with as a nation.
Well, way back in 1987, when I was working, or 1986, when I was working on that HIV book, one of the chapters was about HIV among drug users. And one of the points that I think we made in that chapter, or that the author made and I edited in or something, as I recall, was I think a simple but important point, which is that if you look at individual choice or individual lives, and you find somebody who has used drugs in a way that has led them to have a substance use disorder and to be at risk of overdose or to have suffered overdose, you can say that's sort of a tragic choice. That's a bad choice. You can say whatever you like about it. It's not good for that individual. Probably the individual should have done something different. And you can even say that person's fate now depends upon them finding a way out of that substance use disorder and to move to a safer lifestyle. But when you have millions of people in that fix, when you have the highest overdose rate in the world, and you have really high rates of substance abuse across the society and substance use disorder, then you have to say, this is at the social level a social failure. This is caused by social conditions. This is caused by too much stress being placed on people in one way or another in their lives. It's caused by too few opportunities, too few alternatives. You have to ask yourself, what kind of society, what is it about this society that makes using dangerous drugs an apparently rational alternative for so many people? And that's where I think, you get to the heart of it, which is that substance use in the United States has grown in lockstep with economic inequality. When I was born in 1956, we were about the most equal we'd ever been. That is to say, the gap between the salary of the CEO and the salary of somebody working on the assembly line was pretty small. Maybe 10 times, 15 times. In the years since, and particularly starting in the 80s in the Reagan administration, we have now developed through tax policy, through employment policy, through general disinvestment in public goods that essentially transfer resources to lower income people. We've reached the highest degree of economic inequality basically in our entire history. And throughout the world, and throughout any kind of epidemiological analysis, great social inequality is associated with all sorts of poor health outcomes and worse health for the whole population. Our form of social inequality health happens to be heavily inflected by substance use disorder and opioid overdose. But if it weren't that, it'd be something else. Mm-hmm. And you also see it in rates of diabetes. You saw it in COVID. COVID was a socially inflected disease. Poorer people did worse. And we'll continue to see it in social tension and violence and in all the stressors that lead people to suboptimal lifestyles.
Well, certainly COVID, people who had the means could escape the hotspots and live a more isolated life, et cetera. That's certainly true. Would you say, addiction obviously affects all economic levels. Would you say that opioid is an addiction that tends to be for people with fewer economic resources? People with more economic resources, they find addictive substances as well. But is the opioid crisis more prevalent among lower income? Is that sort of the addiction of the lower income people?
Well, I think at this point we kind of have to start thinking about it, even the term addiction. Mm-hmm. We can say that mortality for opioid overdose has been socially divided. Okay. So that people without a college education, without a high school education are much more at risk of overdose in every age cohort for the last 20 years. That's the work of the sort of deaths of despair demographer Angus Deaton and his wife Ann Case, and they've shown this persistent association between social education level, essentially social class, and mortality from opioids. And their explanation is that essentially these are, as they say, deaths of despair. As they say, people are turning to opioids for a variety of reasons, generally associated with poor healthcare access, poor economic opportunity. They're working in lower wage jobs that are more physical. They suffer pain. They start to take the opioids. But it's also important, so they're more likely to be exposed and therefore more likely to become dependent. But it's also important to understand that our concept of heroin and opioids and addiction is a little bit flawed. The popular imagination is that everybody who touches these drugs, you touch it once, it's like a tar baby. You are now stuck to it. You can never escape. You're addicted. It's really important to remember that there is a lot of recreational use that goes on that does not lead to a substance use disorder. There's a lot of people who are physically dependent, like you might be on caffeine. That is to say, if they stop using the drug, they will feel some withdrawal and some physical discomfort. But they're actually not displaying the symptoms of substance use disorder, which basically have to do with leading a disorganized, increasingly toxic, life that's increasingly toxic to you and others. So it's always been the case, for 20, 30, 40 years that we've been studying this, that the majority of people who use opioids are employed. In fact, the majority who use most drugs are employed people who go to their job every day, meet their financial and family responsibilities, and are not, engaged. They're not the sort of highly ill substance use disorder sufferer living on the street in a neighborhood, like Kensington in Philadelphia or the Tenderloin in San Francisco. So we got to be really careful not to sort of use the person with the worst substance use disorder as the sort of poster child for what opioid use is. The problem with opioid use now is the fact that, what happened in our epidemic was say in the year 2000, which is actually when I started to work on drug overdose, we had a long-standing problem of heroin overdose among heroin users, and it happened because of various inflection points, like people who would transition to needle injection from snorting heroin, who would not realize the risk of an increased dose directly into the bloodstream, or people who had been in jail and then came out and resumed their old level of use. But we had a fairly stable potency in the market, and so it was a chronic, low-level problem, still a serious problem. Mm-hmm. Still, thousands of people dying each year. Then with the opioid epidemic and the rise of prescription opioids and the flooding of the market that we've all heard about from, the opioid manufacturers, you had a lot more people using them. And with that lot more people, even a small rate of overdose became great. Even a small rate of developing substance use disorder started to produce a lot of people. And then we started to see a big uptick in overdose because there were just so many more people who could make a mistake, who could, have a problem, use the wrong drug, not realize their potency. And so you had that rise. Around 2010, 2012, the world finally woke up to this. Like I say, I started working this on the year 2000. There were people doing naloxone distribution and needle exchanges in the early aughts. Those people knew there was a problem, but the world wasn't listening. It wasn't a public problem. Once it became a public problem, you had this big reaction, and some of it was helpful, like trying to enact easier access to naloxone, the antidote for overdose, across the board. But some of it was more punitive and had to do with trying to cut down supply of legal opioids and to restrict further access to illegal opioids.
Well, if I may, let's focus on that then for a bit. The world woke up, which means, I guess, government and policymakers wake up. There are regulations out there, which I think that's what you're suggesting, that there are some regulations maybe were helpful and some were certainly not. So what insight can you give us, if you wouldn't mind continuing, about the positives or negatives of any attempt to regulate once the world did wake up?
Well, so this is a kind of hard problem to sort out, and certainly a hard problem to face, right? So it was very clear that we were probably giving too many people too many pills. Which is not to say that opioids don't have their use and don't have benefits for a wide range of patients, but when you have billions of pills circulating, and people not fully appreciating the risks, you have a recipe for the kind of disaster that we had. So then the challenge becomes, well, okay, how do we start to roll back on the availability of this without doing new damage? And the way you do new damage, first of all, is to cut back too much, to make it too hard to get opioids, which can lead to people. I mean, and the reason that that's a problem, the reason why success in reducing prescriptions and success in reducing pills dispensed is not necessarily a public health success, is that the government and the doctors don't control the full opioid market. If you can't get your drug at Rite Aid or CVS, there is a street pharmacy where you can buy your opioid in every city in the country. So you have a concern about substitution. And that concern about substitution becomes even more acute if it's difficult to get treatment. So if you restrict legal access and start to cut people off from the drugs that they have become habituated to, whether or not they have a substance use disorder, they could just be dependent on it physically to avoid pain. Mm-hmm. If you don't provide an alternative, or you don't provide ready access to methadone or buprenorphine to help wean them from the pills they're dependent on, they are quite possibly going to go to a new source, an illegal street supply. That illegal street supply could be something that is a pill, an actual oxycodone pill, for example. It could be something that looks like an oxycodone pill and is packaged like an oxycodone pill, but is a Chinese counterfeit. Or they'll just go directly to heroin. And then the question is, what are they actually buying? In the legal market, at least we knew what they were getting and what the dose was. In the illegal market, it's a lottery. And what happened is that as legal supply started to go down, but demand remained the same, the illegal market started to meet that demand and to react to increased law enforcement pressure by finding a more efficient delivery vehicle for opioid doses, which is fentanyl. Fentanyl had popped up in the illegal drug supply before in the mid-aughts. But it turned out to be one laboratory in Mexico that kind of was trying to innovate and killed a bunch of people and eventually was shut down. But the idea that you could stick fentanyl and the availability of fentanyl was there. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that after 2010, you just started to see a lot more fentanyl in illegal drugs. And the problem with fentanyl is it's 100 times more potent than heroin. And even a small amount can drive up the potency of a dose way off the safe level and way off what the user expects. And so we had a decline in prescriptions, and we had a decline in sales of legal opioids, which everybody thought should eliminate the overdose problem. But deaths just continued to skyrocket.
Now, are you saying that the regulations were only sort of half effective, which then leads to disaster? That is to say, they started to reduce the supply, but they didn't mandate any kind of effective treatment alternative or something else that would try to mitigate the impact of the reduced supply. They were only sort of half measures in that sense.
Exactly. We didn't really look at the whole problem. And part of that, I think, is based on a couple of delusions that plague our broader drug policy landscape. One delusion is the delusion of control. The U.S. drug control machine, the DEA, the state and local police, have never controlled access to illegal drugs. The price potency, sort of ratio of heroin has only, I don't know what to say, improved, gotten worse. But, basically today, heroin is cheaper and more potent than it was in 1972 when we enacted the Controlled Substances Act. It's just really impossible not to stress or not to underestimate the degree of failure to achieve its basic ends. that we see in the Controlled Substances Act, quite apart from the various kinds of ancillary human costs, side effects from this treatment, this legal treatment that we've seen. So that's that's one delusion, and I think the other is the delusion of abstinence, the idea that the sort of attainable state for drug use is a world without drugs, as the UN Drug Control Office likes to always talk about. We've never had a world without drugs, as far as I can tell, in human history, and we're never going to have one under imaginable conditions. We have some drugs we call legal, like alcohol and tobacco, that kill a lot of people, but we call them legal. And then we have drugs like heroin and cocaine that we call illegal, and that we say nobody should ever use, and they kill a lot of people. Our goal in all these instances, the goal that we have to strive towards, and the opioid epidemic certainly points us to, is how we know that drugs have benefits that make people want to use them. We also know that nearly all drugs have negative effects and dangers that we in public health want to reduce. In public health, I would say we generally want to reduce the use of virtually all drugs, and to add harm reduction features that makes the use safer. But we can't pretend that we're going to stop it. And that leads to the second part of the equation, which is, what's the damage done by our legal system for regulating the drugs? Because legal systems for regulation also cause harm. The Controlled Substances Act has done horrible things to our incarceration rates and to whole communities. It's been a racist tool that has either deliberately, as some attribute to the Nixon administration, or incidentally led to the decimation of communities all over the country, where half the men are in jail because of drug use, where we create probation. And in Philadelphia, where I live, people can be on probation for a joint for 20 years. So it has all these costs. Our goal should be, how do we reduce the deaths and the harms of drugs, while at the same time minimizing the costs of the regulatory system? And I can tell you there's only one direction to go, and that's some form of decriminalization, legalization, and regulation.
Okay. But along with that, would you say that there has to be a more significant devotion of resources to treatment? I mean, sure, it's one thing to decriminalize. I understand the point you're making about how that would stop a certain kind of devastation among communities, particularly with respect to incarceration. But is the last piece of the puzzle, the very significant piece of the puzzle, also devoting resources to treatment as opposed to some of these more punitive sorts of regulation and policies?
Well, yes, mostly. I think that's right. But there's a couple of points to throw in here. One is that regulation is also a barrier to treatment now. Methadone is harder to get than oxycodone. Doctors who prescribe buprenorphine are still more restricted than doctors prescribing oxycodone, right? So the treatment should not be harder than the cause of the disease to prescribe and get. So that's one thing we do. We clean up the regulations to some degree, and then of course make it more readily available. We have to make sure that prisons and jails and drug courts and so on get over the idea that the only proper treatment is 12-step or something like that. That medication-assisted treatment, which is the best evidence-based treatment out there, should be offered. But the other really important thing to recognize when we think about this is a limitation of treatment, and that is that the majority of people who are using opioids do not have substance use disorders. It is not a substance use disorder to use opioids. It's only a substance use disorder if it starts to mess up your life. And so people whose lives are not messed up, who don't have a clinical substance use disorder, are generally not going to want or really to need treatment. What they need is a safe, regulated supply to an appropriately, dosed and regulated formulation of their drug of choice. Right. You don't want to go in and buy a beer that turns out to be 100 proof.
Mhm.
You know, you don't want to buy a dose of opioid and have it turn out to be a dose of fentanyl.
Okay. Well, obviously the complexity continues to grow, and one avenue that both governments and private individuals are pursuing is litigation. And you make an interesting point that the absolute numbers have gone up so much as far as opioid use, which of course raises the relative numbers of mortality. So one resort, again, whether it's government entities, counties, states, or private individuals, is litigation against really all the players in terms of manufacturers, distributors, marketers, those writing the prescriptions. If you perhaps, as we near the end of our podcast, can share some of your views on the litigation in terms of whatever insights you may have.
I think by and large, the litigation is pretty well justified. If we go back to the 90s, it was known that if you give people opioids, a notable proportion of such people, then the estimates were somewhere, probably 5% was a good estimate, of people being treated in clinical settings might still develop an opioid substance use disorder. Right. So even with good clinical supervision and so on, you can imagine it might be worse without good supervision, because this data mostly came from cancer patients and others who were, being very well treated and very well cared for. We also knew in the 90s that pharmaceutical advertising was really effective for doctors, that you could really change their behavior and get them to prescribe stuff on a large scale with the right advertising. So both FDA and the makers of oxycodone knew this at the time. It was knowable, but FDA put no restrictions, basically no serious restrictions on the sale of oxycodone. It bought the idea that this would be a safer formulation, despite the fact that there wasn't evidence, and then everybody went to town.
All right, excuse me. I do want you to continue absolutely with this, but just for some of our listeners who may not be familiar. You do see commercials on television for drugs and prescription drugs, but as Professor Burris points out, historically, the primary pharmaceutical advertising target was the prescriber, that is to say, the doctor. And so I'll ask Professor Burris to continue, keeping that in mind.
Thanks. No, that's exactly right. So basically, this was a storm that was predictable, if not predicted. And then, by the year 2000 or so, CDC epidemiologists were already seeing the increase in overdose. And there were already cases in the early aughts being brought by, district, U.S. attorneys and various, in some districts about the mismarketing and the false claims. But as I say, we just kind of, as a policy matter, kind of let this happen. And didn't really start to do anything until newspapers and TV stations and so on were starting to cover this as a problem, and then policymakers woke up and started to act. So, but my point is that all that time, the players who were selling the stuff knew what they were doing, and so I think having them pay back some of the enormous costs that individuals and cities and counties have paid and states have paid is fully appropriate.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to hear you say, have that perspective. I'm your basic torts professor, but I have a significant interest in what I and others call negligent marketing, which can apply to a lot of different products. And the word negligent, in this case, you probably have quotes around it, because some of this is clearly intentional. But it tends to be more presented, well, that state of mind is very difficult to prove. So we'll go along with sort of a negligent marketing approach. Sometimes this has been successful, sometimes it hasn't. Some lower courts have done it, they've been reversed. But I always found the negligent marketing notion, with negligent really including almost a reckless or an intentional component, to be really an avenue that can be explored so that the courts and lawmakers aren't grasping at things like public nuisance, et cetera, which that's typically a property concept. I mean, I do think there is this route directed at marketing, and it's not just for opioids, but the scale of the opioid crisis perhaps provides an opportunity to see if that theory gains any traction. I think that's what you're talking about in some sense.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, we're always going to be in a world in which, from a practical litigation point of view, people are going to grab what they think they can do best with, in the venues that they want to go. And, the tobacco litigation was a great example of how you might try and use a sort of nuisance concept to generate some serious recovery. But I think you're right. And frankly, I do think this really, as a former torts professor, I'd say this is a pretty good example of recklessness, because they were willfully blind to the evidence that was all around them and that they really had access to, and just continued to pretend that it was that their original beliefs or claims were correct.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, one of the things we talk about in common law torts, there's a very limited vocabulary. It's like if you're really, really negligent, well, you're negligent. I mean, we don't really, I mean, recklessness isn't even barely a common law word in that sense. But clearly, I would agree with you. This is almost at a minimum the perfect example of reckless. And I also point out to our listeners that when you read a complaint, whether it's in tobacco litigation or even firearm litigation or opioid litigation, or even just a basic products liability action, you see so many different actions alleged. That's the lawyer's job. All the possible theories I could think of in my jurisdiction, because I only need to prevail on one. So that is interesting from an academic and even from a practitioner's point of view. I do invite you to have the last word or words. You're not limited, but if you'd like to leave us with some closing comments or observations, they would be welcome.
Well, I think we need a concept of public good and social responsibility in our companies and in our citizens more than ever. And we need competent regulation more than ever. It's a complex world. We really cannot negotiate our way through it unless we have good government and responsible stewardship and citizenship by the companies that drive our economy. This is an instance of failure, and it fails for a few basic reasons. One is that we allow ourselves to believe that legal solutions that don't work. So our belief that somehow we can depend upon the DEA and the Controlled Substances Act to deal with our drug issues. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. We have believed that we can trust industry. And I think we have to be a little more skeptical. Trust but verify. We could believe that we could kind of water down and harness and pressure our FDA regulatory agency to be more industry friendly. But that's not true. We need a strong FDA that looks out for the public good and isn't just a processor of applications for new drugs. And so that means that we as citizens really have to re-engage in demanding good government and supporting good government. Just writing government off may feel good, but it ain't going to lead to a good place. Mm-hmm. Finally, I think that takes us to the ultimate policy issue in opioids, and I think in health, is how do we get back to a place where everybody feels like they've got a decent opportunity in life, where they have a house they can afford, where they can, send their kids to a good school and have hope that their kids will do better than they did, that they can have a few weeks vacation, sick leave, and health insurance. People are not asking for much, and it doesn't take much for a good life. But, we're increasingly in a country where it's an incredible burden for a lot of people even to get there. And more people are falling into a kind of no person's land of poor employment, poor housing, poor schooling, no opportunity.
And then all of it exacerbated by COVID.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
COVID, and now, and don't forget climate change. Yeah. I mean, we've got opioids was a slow moving disaster we could have prevented, but didn't. COVID was a pretty fast moving disaster that we could have dealt with better. And all of it's pointing to the ultimate disaster that's slowly creeping up on us, which is climate change. We have got to get it together and recommit to working together to solve these problems or mitigate these problems as well as we can. And we lawyers, we got to lead the way.
All right.
Rule of law, baby.
Yeah, let me well forget that. Professor Burris, thank you first and foremost for your passion and your dedication. It's always inspiring. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
It was a pleasure. Hello to everybody at Toro.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.